I will talk now about the eclipse of the true church. For 60 years, we have witnessed the eclipse of the true church by an anti-church that has progressively appropriated her name, occupied the Roman Curia and her dicasteries, dioceses and parishes, seminaries and universities, convents and monasteries. The anti-church has usurped her authority, and its ministers wear her sacred garment. It uses her prestige and power to appropriate her treasure, assets and finances, just as happened in nature. This eclipse does not take place all at once. It passed from light to darkness when a celestial body inserts itself between the sun and us. This is a relatively slow but inexorable process in which the moon of the anti-church follows its orbit until it overlaps the sun, generating a cone or shadow that projects over the earth. We now find ourselves in this doctrinal, moral, liturgical, and disciplinary cone or shadow. It is not yet the total eclipse that we'll see at the end of time, under the reign of the Antichrist, but it's a partial eclipse, which let us see the luminous crown of the sun encircling the black disk of the moon. The process that led to the today eclipse of the Church began with the modernism, without a doubt. The anti-church followed its orbit despite the solemn condemnations of the magisterium, which in that phase shone with the splendor of truth. But with the Second Vatican Council, the darkness of this spurious entity came over the Church. Initially, it obscured only a small part, but darkness gradually increased. Whoever then pointed to the sun, deducing that the moon would certainly obscure it, was accused of being a prophet of doom, with those forms of fanaticism and intemperance that arise from the ignorance and prejudice. The case of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and a few other prelates confirms, on one hand, the far-sightedness of these shepherds, and, on the other hand, the disjointed reaction of their adversaries, who out of fear of losing power, using all their authority to deny the evidence and kept hidden their own true intention. To continue the analogy, we can say that in the sky of the faith, an eclipse is a rare and extraordinary phenomenon. But to deny that during the eclipse darkness spreads, just because this does not happen under ordinary conditions, is not a sign of faith in the effectibility of the Church, but rather an obstinate denial of the evidence or bad faith. The Holy Church, according to Christ's promises, will never be overwhelmed by the gates of hell, but does not mean that she will not be or is not already overshadowed by her infernal forgery, the anti-church. That moon, not by chance, we see under the feet of a woman in the book of the Revelation. I quote, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars." The moon is under the feet of the woman, with above all mutability, above all earthly corruption, above the law of fate and the kingdom of the spirit of this world. And this is because that woman, who is at once the image of Mary most holy and of the Church, is a micta sole, clothed with the sun of the righteousness that is Christ, exempted from all demonic power, as she takes part in the mystery of the immutability of Christ, as St. Ambrose wrote. She remained unbruised, if not in her militant kingdom, certainly in the suffering one and the purgatory, and in the triumphant ones in paradise. St. Jerome, commenting on the words of Scripture, reminds us that the gates of hell are sins and vices, especially the teaching of heretics. We know, therefore, that even the synthesis of all heresies represented by modernism and its updated conciliar versions can never definitively obscure the splendor of the bride of Christ, but only for a brief period of the eclipse, that Providence, in His infinite wisdom, has allowed to draw from it a greater good. The abandonment of the supernatural dimension. In this talk, I wish especially to deal with the relationship between the revolution of Vatican II and the establishment of the New World Order. The focal element of this analysis consists in highlighting the abandonment on the part of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, even at the top, of the supernatural dimension of the Church and its eschatological role. With the Council, the innovators erased the divine origin of the Church from their theological horizon, creating an entity of human origin similar to a philanthropic organization. The first consequence of this ontological subversion was the necessary denial of the fact the bride of Christ is not and cannot be subject to change by those who exercise vicarious authority in the name of the Lord. She is neither the property of the Pope nor of the bishop or theologians, and as such, any attempt at aggiornamento lowers her to the level of a company that, in order to garner profit, renews its own commercial offer, sells its leftover stock, and follows the fashion of the moment. The Church, on the other hand, is a supernatural and divine reality. She adapts the way she preaches the gospel to the nations, but she can never change the content of one iota, nor deny her transcendent momentum by lowering herself to mere social service. On the opposite side, the anti-church proudly lays claims to the right to perform a paradigm shift, not only by changing the way doctrine is expounded, but the doctrine itself. Insisting on what the magisterium teaches is useless. The innovator's brazen claim to have the right to change the faith stubbornly following the modernist approach. The Council's first error consists mainly in the lack of the transcendent perspective, the result of a spiritual crisis that was already latent, and the attempt to establish paradise on earth with a sterile human horizon. In line with this approach, Fratelli Tutti sees the fulfillment of an earthly utopia and social redemption in human brotherhood, pax ecumenica between religions, and welcoming migrants. The sense of inferiority and inadequacy. As he has written on other occasions, the revolutionary demands of the Nouvelle Théologie found fertile ground in the Council Fathers because of a serious inferiority complex vis-à-vis the world. There were times in the post-war period when the revolution led by Freemasonry in the civil, political and cultural spheres breached the Catholic elite, persuading it of its inadequacy in the face of the epochal challenge that is now inescapable. Instead of questioning themselves and their faith, this elite bishop, theologian, intellectual recklessly attributed responsibility for the imminent failure of the Church to a rock-solid hierarchical structure, to a monolithic doctrinal and moral teaching, looking at the defeat of the European civilization that the Church had helped to form. The elite thought that the lack of agreement with the world was caused by the intransigence of the papacy and the moral rigidity of priests not wanting to come to terms with the zeitgeist and open up. This theological approach stems from the false assumption that between the Church and the contemporary world there can be an alliance, a consonance of intent, a friendship. Nothing could be further from the truth, since there can be no respite in the struggle between God and Satan, between light and darkness. I quote from the Genesis, "I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." This an enmity willed by God himself, which places Mary most holy and the Church as eternal enemies of the ancient serpent. The world has its own prince, who is the enemy, a murderer from the beginning, and a liar, courting a pact of non-belligerence with the world means coming to terms with Satan. This overturns and perverts the very essence of the Church, whose mission is to convert as many souls to Christ for the greater glory of God, without ever laying down arms against those who want to attract them to themselves and to their damnation.